Blood stained the horizon as crimson as the sins that haunted Colton Iverson's past. A man who rode into Broken Creek, Wyoming Territory in the bitter winter of 1872 with nothing but his Winchester, a reputation that made grown men tremble, and eyes as cold as the mountain streams he camped beside. The townspeople called him Stone Heart behind his back, whispering that the notorious bounty hunter had killed more men than smallpox, though never without the law's blessing, a fact that did little to soften their fear when his tall, broad-shouldered frame darkened their doorways. Julia O'Connor had buried her husband Michael 6 months earlier, leaving her alone with their 5-year-old daughter Emma and a struggling homestead on the outskirts of town. The widow's gentle eyes had grown harder with each passing day as she fought to keep their small farm, her delicate hands now calloused from work that would break most men. She needed help, but pride kept her from asking and circumstance kept most townspeople from offering. Sheriff Dawson stood outside his office, watching Colton tie his dappled gray stallion to the hitching post. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts, Iverson." "Just passing through," Colton replied, his voice low and graveled from too many nights sleeping under open sky. "Got business up north, need supplies." The sheriff nodded toward the general store. "Miller's got what you need, but fair warning, folks haven't forgotten that business with the Blackwell gang. 4 dead men, even if they were outlaws, leaves an impression." 4 men who deserved what they got," Colton said flatly, adjusting his worn leather hat. "I don't much care what folks remember." Inside Miller's general store, Julia struggled to reach a can of beans on the top shelf while little Emma clutched at her skirts. The child's golden curls bounced as she twirled, humming softly, oblivious to her mother's frustration. "Need some help, madam?" The deep voice startled Julia, causing her to step back abruptly. She bumped into a solid chest, turning to find herself looking up at a weather-beaten face partially hidden beneath the shadow of a dusty Stetson. Yes, thank you," she managed, noticing the way his eyes, a surprising shade of green, briefly softened before returning to their customary hardness. He reached past her easily, his proximity causing her heart to skip unexpectedly. "Here," he said, handing her the can. "Thank you, mister." Julia's voice trailed off questioningly. "Iverson, Colton Iverson." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture so automatic it seemed more habit than courtesy. A small gasp escaped from old Mrs. Patterson, who was examining fabric nearby. She hurriedly gathered her selections and shuffled toward the counter, shooting fearful glances over her shoulder. "You're him," Julia said quietly. "The bounty hunter." Colton's jaw tightened. "I am." "Mama, why is the lady scared?" Emma's clear voice cut through the tension, her innocent eyes looking between her mother and the tall stranger. Before Julia could answer, Colton knelt down to the child's level, a movement so unexpected it silenced the whispers that had begun around them. "Some folks just scare easy, little one. Nothing for you to worry about." Emma studied him solemnly before breaking into a smile that lit her entire face. "Your horse is pretty. I saw him outside." The faintest ghost of a smile touched Colton's lips. "His name's Thunder. Can I pet him?" Emma asked eagerly. "Emma," Julia scolded gently, "don't bother Mr. Iverson. He has business to attend to." Colton stood, the almost smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "No bother," he said gruffly, then added to Emma, "Maybe another time, little miss, if your ma approves." Julia watched him stride toward the counter, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Something about the way he'd spoken to Emma with a gentleness that contradicted everything she'd heard about him left her wondering if the rumors of his heartlessness might be somewhat exaggerated. That evening, as Julia tucked Emma into bed in their small but tidy cabin, her daughter's prayers included a surprising addition. "And God bless Mama and Thunder and Mr. Colton," she finished solemnly. "Why are you praying for Mr. Iverson, sweetheart?" Julia asked, smoothing her daughter's curls. Emma's expression grew serious. "Because he looks sad in his eyes, Mama, like you do sometimes when you think I'm not looking." Julia kissed her daughter's forehead, troubled by the child's perceptiveness. "Sleep well, my love." Later, sitting alone by the fire, Julia's thoughts returned to the bounty hunter. The town certainly feared him. William Miller had nervously explained how Colton had tracked the Blackwell gang for 300 miles after they'd robbed and murdered a family in Colorado. He'd brought them to justice single-handedly, returning with 4 bodies draped over horses and not a scratch on himself. Yet there had been that moment of unexpected kindness toward Emma. It was puzzling, a man with supposedly no heart showing gentleness to a child. 3 days passed before Julia saw Colton again. She was struggling to repair her broken wagon wheel when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. The bounty hunter sat atop his gray stallion, observing her predicament. "Wheels shot," he stated simply, dismounting in one fluid motion. Julia straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "I'm managing." His eyes took in the poorly patched wheel, the strain evident on her face and the exhaustion in her posture. "No, madam, you're not." Before she could protest, he'd removed his coat and was examining the wheel. "Got tools in the barn?" "Yes, but I'll need them." His tone brooked no argument. Julia hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "Why would you help me, Mr. Iverson?" He paused, those green eyes meeting hers directly. "Maybe I'm tired of folks crossing the street when they see me coming." It wasn't a complete answer, but something in his expression made her nod and head toward the barn. When she returned with the tools, he was already removing the damaged wheel. "I can pay you," she offered, setting down the toolbox. "Not necessary. I don't accept charity, Mr. Iverson." His hands stilled momentarily. "It's not charity if I'm getting something in return." "And what would that be?" Julia asked warily, conversation that doesn't involve talk of bounties or killing. He resumed working, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each movement. "Been a while since I had that." Julia found herself smiling slightly. "I think I can manage that." As Colton worked, they talked carefully at first, then with growing ease. He asked about her farm, listening intently as she explained her struggles since Michael's death from pneumonia. She learned he'd been tracking bounties for 7 years, ever since returning from the war. "Where's home for you?" she ventured. "Nowhere particular," he replied, focused on fitting the new spokes he'd fashioned. "Haven't had a fixed address since I was 19. That sounds lonely." His hands paused again, and he glanced up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Never thought about it that way." A delighted squeal interrupted them as Emma came running from the house. "Mr. Colton, you came back." To Julia's surprise, Colton's face transformed with a genuine smile, small but real, softening the hard lines around his mouth. "Hello, little miss. Did you bring Thunder? Can I pet him now?" Emma bounced excitedly. "Emma, Mr. Iverson is busy helping with our wagon," Julia began, but Colton was already gesturing toward his horse. "Thunder's right over there. He's gentle, but let's introduce you proper." He stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come on." Julia watched as the feared bounty hunter led her daughter to the magnificent gray stallion, carefully lifting her to stroke the horse's nose. Emma's laughter rang out when Thunder snuffled against her palm, and something shifted in Julia's chest at the sight of Colton's protective hand steadying her daughter. That evening, despite her protests, Colton stayed to finish the wagon and then chopped enough firewood to last a month. When Julia insisted he at least stay for supper, he accepted with a nod that couldn't quite hide his pleased surprise. Over a simple meal of rabbit stew, Emma chattered happily, drawing reluctant chuckles from Colton with her innocent observations. As darkness fell, he stood to leave, settling his hat on his head. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. O'Connor." "Julia," she corrected softly, "after all you've done today, I think we can dispense with formalities." Something flashed in his eyes, warmth perhaps, or something more complex. "Julia," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name, "I'll be in town a few more days if you need anything else fixed. Will you come back tomorrow?" Emma piped up hopefully. "You promised to show me how Thunder does tricks, Emma," Julia chided gently. "I did promise," Colton said, looking to Julia for permission. "If it's no trouble." Julia should have said no. The town already whispered about her, the young widow struggling alone. Having the notorious bounty hunter visiting regularly would only fuel gossip. But the hopeful look on Emma's face, mirrored by something unexpectedly vulnerable in Colton's expression, made her decision for her. No trouble at all, she answered. True to his word, Colton returned the next day and the next. He showed Emma how thunder could bow and count by pawing the ground, fixed the leaking roof Julia had been patching unsuccessfully for months, and mended fences that had fallen into disrepair. Each evening, Julia insisted he stay for supper, and each time he accepted with slightly less reluctance. During these meals, she began to see glimpses of the man beneath the fearsome reputation, a man who listened intently when she spoke, whose rare smiles transformed his face, who treated Emma with gentle patience. In town, whispers followed Julia when she visited the general store. Shameful, Mrs. Patterson muttered to her friend loudly enough for Julia to hear. A respectable widow entertaining that killer. Mind your business, Agatha. William Miller surprisingly came to Julia's defense. Iverson's been nothing but helpful to Mrs. O'Connor. A wolf doesn't change its nature, Mrs. Patterson insisted. He'll bring trouble, mark my words. The predictions of trouble proved accurate, though not in the way the town gossips expected. On a stormy afternoon 2 weeks after Colton's first visit, Julia was gathering eggs when she heard Emma scream from the barn. Heart in her throat, she ran through the downpour to find two rough-looking men standing over her daughter who had fallen among the hay bales. "Well, looky here," the taller man sneered. "The widow's brat. Where's your mama keep the valuables, girl? Get away from my daughter." Julia charged forward, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall. The shorter man laughed, easily wresting it from her grasp. "Feisty one, ain't she, Jed? Maybe we should take our time here." "Don't you touch my mama," Emma cried, launching herself at the man's legs. He swore, raising his hand to strike the child when a metallic click echoed through the barn. "Touch that child and it'll be the last thing you ever do." Colton stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat, his revolver aimed steadily at the shorter man's head. "Iverson," the taller man Jed breathed, recognition and fear crossing his face. "We didn't know this was your business." "It is now," Colton said, his voice deathly quiet. "Drop the knife." The shorter man hesitated, then let his blade fall to the hay-strewn floor. "Now, both of you face down, hands behind your backs." When they complied, Colton quickly bound their wrists with rope from his saddlebag. Only then did he holster his weapon and turn to Julia and Emma. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes rapidly assessing them both. Emma broke away from Julia and flung herself at Colton, wrapping her arms around his legs. "You saved us." Something remarkable happened, then Colton's stern expression crumpled slightly as he awkwardly patted Emma's head. "You're all right now, little one. Who are they?" Julia asked, still trembling. "Harrison brothers. Small-time thieves with big ambitions. Been tracking them since Denver." He gently disentangled himself from Emma and turned to secure the prisoners more thoroughly. "Must have seen me coming here and thought they'd found something worth stealing." "They mentioned valuables," Julia said. Colton nodded grimly. "They've been hitting isolated homesteads, targeting women alone." He didn't elaborate, but Julia understood the unspoken threat that had been averted. "Thank God you arrived when you did," she whispered. Later, after Sheriff Dawson had taken the Harrison brothers to jail and the storm had passed, Colton stood awkwardly in Julia's kitchen, declining her offer to stay the night. "Those men had friends," he explained. "Need to make sure they're not lurking about." "I'll keep watch from the ridge tonight." "That's not necessary, it is," he interrupted firmly. "I brought this trouble to your door. You saved us," Julia countered, stepping closer to him. "Colton, you can't blame yourself for the actions of criminals." He looked down at her, conflict evident in his expression. "Been thinking it's time I moved on anyway. Staying in one place too long isn't smart in my line of work." The words stung more than Julia expected. "I see." Emma, who had been unusually quiet since the incident, suddenly spoke from the doorway where she'd been listening. "Don't go, Mr. Colton. I'm scared they'll come back." The naked plea in the child's voice seemed to pierce through Colton's resolve. He knelt before her, his expression gentler than Julia had ever seen it. "No one's going to hurt you or your mama, Emma, I promise you that." "Then stay," Emma insisted, throwing her arms around his neck. "Please." Over the child's head, Colton's eyes met Julia's, something unspoken passing between them. I'll stay until I'm sure you're safe, he finally agreed. That night, true to his word, Colton kept watch from the ridge overlooking the O'Connor homestead. The following morning, he appeared at their door with a brace of rabbits for breakfast, looking tired but vigilant. This pattern continued for days, with Colton spending his nights guarding the property and his days helping around the farm. The incident with the Harrison brothers seemed to have removed any remaining barriers between them. Julia found herself watching him with Emma, marveling at how naturally they had bonded, how the child had somehow found the heart everyone in town insisted didn't exist. One evening, as they sat on the porch after Emma had gone to bed, Julia finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you become a bounty hunter, Colton?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "After the war, I drifted. Couldn't settle. Then in '65, I was passing through a small town in Kansas when I came upon a farmhouse. Family had been murdered, mother, father, 3 children. His jaw tightened. Youngest wasn't much older than Emma. Julia's hand covered her mouth. "Oh, Colton." Sheriff there knew who did it. Gang of deserters turned outlaws, but he was too afraid to go after them. Colton's eyes were fixed on some distant point. "I wasn't." "You tracked them down," Julia said softly. He nodded once. "Took 2 weeks, brought them all back to face justice. Sheriff offered me the reward money, and I realized I had a talent for hunting men who needed hunting. It became your purpose," she understood suddenly, something like that. He finally looked at her. "Never stayed anywhere long enough to care what folks thought of me, until now." The admission hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "The town fears you," Julia said carefully, "but they don't know you, not like," she stopped herself. "Not like you do," he finished, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes," she met his gaze steadily. "The man they describe, the heartless killer, isn't the man I see when you're with Emma. When you're with me." Something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Julia," the moment was interrupted by Emma's frightened cry from inside the house. They both rushed in to find her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "The bad men were coming back," she sobbed as Julia gathered her close. "It was just a nightmare, sweetheart," Julia soothed, stroking her hair. "The bad men are in jail." Emma hiccuped, looking past her mother to Colton, who stood uncertainly in the doorway. "Will you stay, Mr. Colton, please?" He hesitated, looking to Julia for guidance. "Perhaps just until she falls asleep again," Julia suggested softly. Colton nodded and awkwardly perched on the edge of the bed. To both adults' surprise, Emma immediately crawled from her mother's arms into his lap, her small hands clutching his shirt as she pressed her tear-stained face against his chest. "You won't let the bad men get us," she stated with complete confidence. Something shifted in Colton's expression, a tenderness so raw it made Julia's heart ache. "No, little one," he promised, his large hand gently stroking Emma's back. "No one will harm a hair on your head while I'm around." It took only minutes for Emma to fall back asleep, secure in the protection of the man the town called heartless. As Colton carefully laid her back against her pillow, his calloused fingers brushed her curls with such gentleness that Julia had to blink back sudden tears. In the hallway outside Emma's room, Julia found herself standing closer to Colton than propriety allowed. "Thank you," she whispered. "She's a special child," he replied, his voice hushed. "She adores you." His expression became troubled. "She shouldn't, I'm not. I've done things, Julia. Things that can't be undone. We all have regrets, Colton, but the past doesn't have to define our future." His eyes, usually so guarded, revealed a yearning that took her breath away. "What future could someone like me possibly offer?" Before she could answer, he stepped back, his mask of indifference slipping back into place. "I should get back to my watch." Julia watched him go, wondering if he was guarding them from external threats or from himself. The turning point came unexpectedly, 3 weeks after the Harrison brothers' arrest. Julia was in town collecting supplies when she overheard a conversation between Sheriff Dawson and a stranger wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge. "Iverson still around?" the Marshal asked. "Thought he'd have moved on by now." "Been staying out at the O'Connor place," the sheriff replied. "Widow and her daughter, seems he's taken a shine to them," the Marshal laughed. Stoneheart Iverson, man's a killing machine, not a family man, seems different lately, Dawson mused. Less hard, I guess? Well, he'd better remember who he is. Got a job offer for him, gang of train robbers operating out of Colorado. Army payroll's been hit twice. Need his kind of ruthlessness to track them down. Julia's heart constricted at the thought of Colton leaving, but she knew she had no claim on him. He was who he was, a bounty hunter, a man whose life was defined by the pursuit of outlaws. What right did she have to wish otherwise? That evening, when Colton arrived for supper, his expression was unusually guarded. Emma's chatter failed to draw his customary small smile, and he avoided Julia's questioning gaze. After Emma was tucked in bed, Julia confronted him directly. "You're leaving, aren't you?" He stilled, then nodded once. "Marshal Kane has a job, train robbers in Colorado, I see." She fought to keep her voice steady. "When will you go?" "Tomorrow, early." He finally met her eyes. "The Harrison brothers are being transferred to federal custody. There's no more threat to you and Emma." "So your obligation is fulfilled," Julia said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her tone. "Julia, no, I understand. This is what you do, who you are." She turned away, not wanting him to see the tears threatening to spill. "Emma will miss you. Just Emma." His voice was closer now, just behind her. She whirled to face him. "What do you want me to say, Colton? That these weeks have meant nothing? That watching you with my daughter hasn't shown me a side of you the rest of the world never sees? That I haven't," she stopped herself. "Haven't what?" He pressed, his green eyes intense. "Fallen in love with you," she whispered, the truth finally spoken aloud. For a moment he looked stricken, as if her words had physically wounded him. Then, with surprising gentleness, his hand came up to cup her cheek. "Julia, I'm not the man you think I am." "You're exactly the man I think you are," she countered. "Honorable, protective, kind, though you hide it well. A man who keeps his word and defends those who can't defend themselves." "I've killed men, men who deserved justice," she said firmly. "I know what you've done, Colton." "I also know who you are," he shook his head, conflicted. "I can't offer you what you deserve, a normal life, safety." "I'm not asking for promises." Julia stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart. "I'm just asking you to acknowledge what's happening between us before you ride away." For a breathless moment, he remained frozen. Then, with a sound like surrender, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was tentative at first, then deepening as years of loneliness and self-denial gave way to something neither had expected to find. When they finally broke apart, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "I should still go," he murmured. "It's who I am." "It's what you do," Julia corrected gently, "not who you are." The next morning, Emma woke to find Colton's saddle and gear by the door. Her face crumpled with understanding beyond her years. "You're leaving us." Colton knelt before her, his expression pained. "I have a job to do, little miss." "But we need you here," Emma insisted, tears welling in her blue eyes. "Who will fix the roof when it leaks? Who will scare away the bad men?" "Your mama is stronger than you know," Colton said gently. "And I've taught Peter from town how to help with the repairs. He'll look in on you." Emma's lower lip trembled. "But he's not you." The simple truth in the child's statement seemed to strike Colton deeply. He glanced up at Julia, who stood watching silently, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have to go," he repeated, though with less conviction. Emma threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. "I love you," she sobbed. "Please don't go, Pa." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Colton froze, his arms automatically tightening around the child. Something broke in his expression, the final wall crumbling as a single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. "Emma," Julia began, stepping forward, but Colton held up a hand to stop her. "It's all right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gently set Emma back to look into her eyes. "You know I'm not really your pa, right?" Emma nodded solemnly. "But you take care of us like Daddy did. You make Mama smile again. You keep the bad men away." Her small hand reached up to touch his wet cheek. "Why are you crying?" Colton struggled visibly with his composure. "Because no one's ever." He couldn't finish, drawing the child back into his embrace instead. Over Emma's head, his eyes met Julia's, naked vulnerability in his gaze. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, how to be what she needs, what you need. Julia crossed to them, kneeling beside them both. You already are, she said softly. The question is whether it's what you want. For a long moment, Colton remained silent, his internal struggle evident. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. Marshall Kane will have to find someone else for his job. Emma pulled back, hope dawning on her tear-stained face. You're staying, he nodded, a smile slowly transforming his features. If your mama will have me. Always, Julia whispered, her heart too full for more words. 3 months later, on a perfect spring morning, Julia O'Connor became Julia Iverson in a simple ceremony attended by the surprisingly supportive townspeople of Broken Creek. Sheriff Dawson stood as Colton's best man, while Emma proudly carried flowers as her mother's attendant. The feared bounty hunter hung up his guns, though his reputation ensured the O'Connor, now Iverson homestead, remained the most secure in the territory. With his knowledge of horses and Julia's farming skills, they expanded their operation to include breeding and training quality stock. By the time their son, Michael Colton Iverson, was born a year later, few in town could remember why they had ever feared the quiet, hard-working man who doted on his wife and children. The nickname Stoneheart faded into memory, replaced by stories of how he'd wept when a little girl had called him Pa. On Emma's 7th birthday, Colton officially adopted her, presenting her with her own pony, a gentle, dappled mare descended from his faithful Thunder. As Emma hugged him fiercely, calling him Pa with the ease of long practice, Julia watched the man she loved blink back tears of joy. Everyone was wrong about you, she said later that night as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in hues of gold and crimson. How's that? He asked, his arm around her shoulders. They said you had no heart, Julia replied, leaning into his embrace, but yours was just waiting for the right people to claim it. Colton smiled, the expression now coming naturally to the man who once rarely showed emotion. Best surrender I ever made, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple as the stars began to appear above their home, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky.